Hello, my name is Gerard. Welcome to the Clean Energy Regulator webinar, Opportunities for Land and Sea Transport Projects. In just a few moments, Purdy Patterson will be presenting to you. Before we get underway with the presentation, I have some house rules to go through and some helpful tips with using our webinar system. Please mute your telephone or microphone. This is to minimize background noise during the presentation. This is a live presentation and we encourage questions. To send us a question, please locate on your screen the chat box in the bottom left corner. There is a small text entry field beneath the chat box. Please type your questions in that box and press the Enter key on your keyboard to send it. All questions typed will be visible to other attendees to encourage discussion. At the conclusion of the webinar, there will also be a small survey which we encourage you to fill in as we value your feedback on these presentations. If you need any technical support, please contact the Redback support team, who are our service providers for this service. Their contact details are located in the chat box at the very top. You may need to scroll once there's been some chatting during the webinar session. And so without further ado, I will now pass over to Purdy. Thank you, Purdy.
Hello. Thank you for joining the presentation. My name is Purdy Patterson and I work in the Industrial and Transport section at the Clean Energy Regulator. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to the Emissions Reduction Fund, Land and Sea Transport Method and the process of applying. Recently, the Clean Energy Regulator has announced the next auction will take place on the 4th and 5th of November 2015. Today's webinar is designed to help you to understand the main components of the Land and Sea Transport Method. This section will cover some general information about the Emissions Reduction Fund. There's been a lot of focus in the ERF auctions and contracts process, and it has led to some confusion about participation in the ERF. The government is purchasing Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs, through carbon abatement contracts. In order to get a contract, you have to have a registered project. However, you do not need to have a contract in order to earn ACCUs. It is potentially useful to think about the ERF as having two components. The first component is earning ACCUs by running a compliant ERF project. ACCUs are credited to your Australian National Register of Emissions Units account, or ANRU account. You do not need a contract to do this. Second component of participating in the ERF relates to how you sell your ACCUs. You can choose to bid for a carbon abatement contract through that commit to sell some or all of your ACCUs to the government. To do this, you will need to be able to provide a minimum of 2,000 tonnes per annum. You can also sell your ACCUs to secondary market participants, or you can hang on to your ACCUs while you determine what to do with them. The important point to make here is that the second component, and whether you do or do not have a carbon abatement contract, has no impact on the first component, what you have to do to earn ACCUs from your project. Earning the ACCUs is completely independent of the contract process. More information about auctions and contract establishment processes are available on our website. The method is a legal document called a legislative instrument. It can be read and downloaded from the regulators or the Common Law website. You should refer to the legislative instrument when you consider doing a project or completing the requirements of a project. In the next section, I'm going to briefly cover some of the requirements for a land and sea transport project, which you should be aware of when planning a project. The method sets out the requirements for carrying out the project. Part 1, Section 5 of this, includes the legal definition of the terms used in the method. Part 2 describes what a land and sea transport project is. Part 3 specifies the project requirements according to the project type. There are two types of land and sea projects. Part 4 sets out all the equations to calculate the carbon abatement from the project. Part 5 contains the requirements for reporting, monitoring and record keeping. Schedule 1 lists the service units that must be used for a project. Schedule 2 lists the decline rates for a group of vehicles project. And the method also has an explanatory statement which provides further information on how the method is applied. There are a number of eligibility criteria. All project participants must understand the requirements which are specified in Section 27 of the Carbon Credits Act and associated legislation. The project activities cannot be a regulatory requirement. For a project to be declared an eligible project, the project activities must not be required to be carried out by law. This includes any license or permit conditions which are a requirement of any state or territory. The project must be carried out in Australia and must involve new activities. The potential participant must also have the legal right under the project on at least one vehicle at the time of application. Other eligibility criteria may also apply. Baseline data is a requirement for all projects. The project participant must have 3 years of historical data for each vehicle or group of vehicles. This data must be collected over 3 consecutive years immediately prior to the project starting. The data must include the fuel type and the quantity used, and also the quantity of service in the specified service units. This information is used to calculate the baseline emissions intensity. For projects involving replacement of light vehicles and where previous fuel use cannot be measured, the Green Vehicle Guide can be used to determine the baseline emissions intensity. So, which vehicles can be included in a land and sea transport project? Most land and sea vehicle categories are eligible. The eligible vehicle categories are found in Schedule 1 of the method. Land and sea projects must involve one or more of the following activities. 1, replacing existing vehicles. 2, modification of existing vehicles. 3, changing energy sources, fuel switching, or the mix of energy sources. 4, changing operational practices. There are potentially many activities that can be done in a land and sea transport project, but any of these activities must fit into one of the categories listed in Part 2 of the method. Under the land and sea transport method, there are 2 types of projects: group of vehicles project or aggregated individual vehicles project. The type of project chosen is largely dependent on what data is available and whether the project will involve different vehicle categories or a largely homogeneous group. So a group of vehicles project credits emissions reductions from a group of vehicles. The group of vehicles can be made up of subgroups, where each subgroup is made up of all vehicles in a vehicle category within a business unit or transport operation. The group or subgroup is treated as a single entity with a single set of fuel and service data. Emissions reductions are credited against a historically derived emissions intensity baseline, which for some vehicle categories will decline over time. Emissions reductions from each subgroup are then added together. This type of project is likely to be suitable when proponents do not have data disaggregated to individual vehicles. An aggregated individual vehicles project credits emissions reductions achieved by individual vehicles. The vehicles can be in different vehicle categories and do not need to be related. Similarly, emissions reductions are credited against a historically derived emissions intensity baseline for individual vehicles. Here is a table presenting some of the main differences between the 2 types of projects. The main thing to note is that a group of vehicles project can include light vehicles and excludes mobile equipment, and for aggregated individual vehicle project types, the opposite applies. Service units are specified in Schedule 1 of the method. The definition of all the abbreviation of service units are in Section 5 of the method. The project must use the same service unit for a vehicle category for every reporting period. The service unit for a vehicle category cannot change midway through a project. You must retain records to justify all of your calculations. records must be kept for 7 years after the making of the record. Please ensure that you review Part 5 of the method and relevant sections of the legislative rule to make sure you understand the records you need to retain. Part 4 of the method contains all the equations required to calculate abatement. You should ensure you have a strong understanding of these calculations and how they will affect your project. In this section, I'm going to briefly describe the main calculations under this method and present some simple scenarios. Before we get into that, I'm going to show you this diagram very briefly. It can be found in the Land and Sea Transport Guide available on the regulator's website. This diagram provides an overview of all the equations in the method and highlights the differences between the two project types. Depending on the project, usually only a subset of the equations need to be used. The method calculations use emissions intensity for vehicles or groups of vehicles. Emissions intensity is calculated by multiplying the quantity of fuel used in a period by the energy content of that type of fuel multiplied by the emissions factors of that fuel, which is then divided by the quantity of service in the appropriate service units. To calculate the project baseline, you first need to determine the baseline emissions intensity for each subgroup of vehicles or individual vehicle. The process can be broken into the following steps. Determine emissions intensity for the 3 previous years. Use the lowest historical emission intensity to determine the baseline emissions. The next step is to calculate the project baseline emissions in carbon dioxide equivalent. Multiply the baseline emissions intensity with the quantity of service of the vehicle or group of vehicles. Then you must calculate the emissions from the project by multiplying baseline emissions intensity with the quantity of service of the vehicle or subgroup of vehicles. Apply a decline rate if required. To calculate the net abatement amount, subtract actual project emissions from baseline emissions intensity multiplied by the project service units. A reference tool you will need when completing the calculations is Part 4 of Schedule 1 in the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Measurement Determination 2008. This schedule provides energy content factors and the emission factors for the fuel types used in the method calculations. So this section will cover some examples of possible land and sea transport projects and calculations. In this scenario, there are 117 articulated and rigid trucks, each travelling 1,000 kilometres per day. The baseline is calculated as 7 million litres of diesel, which emits almost 19,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in a month. The project activity is converting the entire truck fleet to biodiesel. The number of kilometres travelled is unchanged. However, fuel use increases due to the lower energy content of biodiesel. Greenhouse gas emissions are much lower. After the project activity is conducted, the actual emissions are about 850 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The project abatement is calculated by subtracting the baseline emissions from the actual emissions, with a net abatement equating to about 18,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent equates to 1 ACCU. So if ACCUs were worth $13.95 each, then the payment would be over $250,000 per month. In the first auction, the average ACCU price was $13.95. Now I'll go over a second scenario. The project activities in this scenario will result in a percentage improvement to the fuel efficiency. In this scenario, it uses the same baseline of 117 articulated and rigid trucks, emitting close to 19,000 tonnes of CO2 each month. Project implements improvements to engines, driver training, and idle reduction. These project activities reduce fuel use by 1 million litres of diesel each month compared with business as usual. The number of kilometres travelled per month remains the same. So the project activities reduce fuel use to 6 million litres of diesel per month. In terms of abatement, this reduces carbon emissions by about 2,700 tonnes of CO2. From this scenario, the abatement is about 2,700 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, which is equivalent to the same number of ACCUs. If ACCUs are priced at $13.95 each, then this would equate to approximately 37,000. However, as mentioned in the previous slide, the project also leads to significant fuel savings. I would like to briefly talk about projects involving changing transport modes. For example, changing from trucks to trains. This is allowable in the method under the aggregated individual vehicles project type. So changing transport modes is possible. However, the baseline for abatement calculations must use whichever is lower, the replaced vehicle or a vehicle in the reference group in the same vehicle category as the replacement vehicle. As discussed earlier, the baseline calculations require 3 years of historical data on fuel use, fuel type, and quantity of service. So in the case of replacing articulated trucks with rail freight trains, you need to do 2 calculations for the project baseline and then compare them. In this example, the baseline emissions intensity of an articulated baseline emissions intensity for a rail freight train is 0.0013. The baseline emissions intensity for this project is the lower of the 2 values. Therefore, the project baseline is the emissions intensity of the rail freight train. Participants choosing this type of activity need to carefully consider the possible abatement from the project. An application to register an eligible offsets project under this method must be made in the manner and form required by the regulator. Here are some tips for ensuring a smooth application process. First tip, make sure you have read and understood the method, legislative rule, and the Carbon Credits Act before making an application. The method describes specific information to be included in the application for declaration. For a group of vehicles project, read section 12 of the method. For an aggregated individuals project, read section 15 of the method. This is the minimum information to be included in your application for the regulator to declare your project eligible. To find the application form, go to our website and under the ERF section, find Forms and Resources page. Then click on Apply to Participate. Follow the link to the client portal. You may have to create an account. Select My Online Forms and the ERF project application. If you have not previously applied to register a project under the ERF, you will be required to submit a client information form. This is also done through the client portal. There are strict legislative requirements for completing the client information form, and I would encourage you to read the guidance document available on the regulator's website. The form needs to be completed differently for participants with different circumstances and business structures, and certified copies of a range of documents may need to be provided. The guide will assist you in determining what documents you need. When completing a client information form, you should be aware that a body corporate is a formal term for a corporation or company. Ensure your document certifications are completed and dated correctly. Information on how to correctly certify a document can be found on page 12 of the guide I mentioned in the previous slide. If you are providing a copy of your driver's license, the address on the individual's driver's license must match the address provided in your application. Please only use full birth certificates, as birth extracts cannot be accepted. Project eligibility details. The section of the application form where you provide the details of your project. The project application form requires you to provide information about the project activities. For a group of vehicles project, section 12 of the method details the descriptions you must provide at the time of application. You must provide details of the group or subgroup of vehicles, including the vehicle categories and number of vehicles, the transport operations and business units, the duty cycles of the vehicles, and the service unit for each group or subgroup. If there is any intended use of the Green Vehicle Guide, then the application must include a statement about why fuel consumption cannot be measured. For an aggregated individual vehicles project, section 12 of the method details the descriptions you must provide. The project application must include descriptions of the duty cycles of the vehicles, project activities involved, an estimate of the number of and categories of vehicles, the service unit for each vehicle. Descriptions may be done by class and, where appropriate, by including a reference to vehicle categories. In the project application form, you will be asked to provide a description of how you have the legal right to undertake the project, and you may be requested to provide evidence of this right. If you have not got the legal right, you may have an agreement with the person who transfers their legal right to you. This agreement must recognise two things: that you, as the participant of the project, have the right to undertake the project works and to claim the accuse. The regulator can only approve projects where the applicant has the legal right to undertake the activity. However, this means that at application you must have the legal right to at least one vehicle or one group of vehicles that you will have the right to undertake the project activities. For example, a vehicle or group of vehicles that you own or have a contract in place with the owner. You may have to obtain legal right from multiple stakeholders. The rights to make changes to a vehicle, for example modifying a vehicle, may be held by the owner and or the lessee of the vehicles and or a third-party service provider. It is your responsibility to ensure that you have the legal right to undertake the project. You must also ensure you have the right to claim the accuse for the project, and no other stakeholder will be claiming credits for the same activities. And just to finish up, some information about the timing of your application. 18th of September is the cut-off date for the application to be submitted in full to the regulator. Please note, if your application requires further information from the regulator, then it has not been submitted in full. If you miss this deadline, you can still participate in the next option. For more information on legal right or any other information about the ERF, please go to our website or call our contact centre. The Regulator's Contact Centre are able to answer general questions about the ERF, application process, and direct you to the relevant information on our website. In addition, AusIndustry is able to provide assistance to potential participants. AusIndustry have customer service managers located in offices around the country who can provide specific advice on your project. We now have a few minutes for questions. Also a reminder to, when you log off the webinar, please complete the survey questions, which should only take a few minutes, and this will help us improve future webinars. Okay, I've got a question here. Does a vehicle lease constitute the legal right to a vehicle, or does the proponent need to own the title of the vehicle? And the answer, it wouldn't automatically give legal right. It would depend on the lease conditions. You will need to discuss the project with the lessor to ensure there are no issues. And I've got a question here. How long is the regulator assessment process for new applications, and can you assure us that it will be approved before the next auction? The answer. You will need to have your project application submitted in full by the 18th of September, which is the cut-off date for project applications prior to the next auction. How long it takes to assess will depend on how complete and accurate your application is. We cannot guarantee that any individual application will be approved before the auction, but our aim is to have applications approved before the auction. Legally, the regulator has 90 days to assess ERF applications. Got a question here. I'd like to propose a new transport type under this method. So the answer is, the methodology determinations are amended or developed by the Department of the Environment through consultation with stakeholders. Any proposals to change existing methods should be directed to the Department of the Environment. Okay, I've got a question here. If a project is registered, will it be audited, even if no funding may have been obtained? There will be administrative requirements, but no return on investment to participate. So the answer. All registered projects are audited, and we encourage you to engage with an auditor early on during the setup phase of your project to determine costs and record-keeping requirements. Okay, so I've got another question here. How many audits do I need to have as part of my project? And where do I find an auditor? The number of scheduled audits will depend on the project size in terms of average total abatement expected to be generated, which is called the forward abatement estimate. All projects will be required to submit an initial audit report, and depending on the amount of expected carbon abatement, the project will be required to submit 2, 3, or 5 subsequent audit reports. You will be sent an audit schedule when your project is registered with the regulator. Okay, so audit reports must be prepared by a registered Category 2 or 3 greenhouse and energy auditor. A list of auditors is available on the Clean Energy Regulator's website and under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting. I've got another question. So when a project is declared the baseline ends, is it possible to go back to the last end of financial year if you can prove no activities have started in the time in between? You can go back to so the answer is, you can go back to when you made the application or even the previous financial or calendar year. All right, I've got a question here. Will I be required to hold an Australian Financial Services licence to run a land and sea transport project? The answer. ACCUs and some aggregation agreements are financial products under the Corporations Law, regulated by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. Therefore, some activities relating to ACCUs and aggregation agreements may be considered providing financial services. For example, if you're providing financial advice with respect to ACCUs, you may be required to hold an AFSL licence or an Australian Financial Services licence. Certain types of aggregated projects, especially those involving ongoing financial relationships between entities, may also be subject to the requirements under Corporations Law. If your project brings together multiple entities or people, provisions related to managed investment schemes may apply to your project. For further information in relation to AFSL and other requirements related to running carbon abatement projects and schemes, there is lots of information on the carbon market section of the ASIC website, or you can call them directly. Okay, so I've got a question here. Can you please clarify the mode shift scenario? For example, if I was running a road freight road freight for an operation between the port and a regional warehouse and wanted to change this to be moved via rail instead. Is the baseline still the rail intensity, even though it wasn't being used in the baseline period? Okay, so the answer. You need to have the legal right for both transport modes and be aware under these situations you may create very few ACCUs. There are several things you need to consider. More information is in the Transport Guide on our website. I've got another question here. For an aggregated individual vehicles method, for mode shift, does the entity have to own the vehicle? The answer, no, but you have to have the legal right to undertake the activity. For example, this will involve discussing the project with the owner and or looking at the lease conditions. Okay. All right, so I've got another question here. What sort of documentation is needed to demonstrate legal right? You must read and understand the information. So the answer is, you must read and understand the information on our website regarding the legal right. When you apply to the Clean Energy Regulator to register a project, you will need to indicate in the project registration form that you have the legal right to carry out the project. Your legal right will need to be described in clear terms and relate to each vehicle or group of vehicles that you are claiming to have the legal right for. Supporting documentation is not necessary at the time of application, but will be audited, so you must have supporting documentation included in your record. You can provide copies of the agreements to support your application if you wish. Such documents could be copies of email exchanges, letters, agreements, or similar documentation, or their extracts. If you provide a contract or similar documentation or their extracts, you should provide an explanation or summary of the parts that are relevant to your legal right and its duration. If you are providing an extract, you should state there is nothing in the other parts of the document from which the extract was made that contradicts the information in the extract or clauses that the information will be incorrect or misleading. So we have a few other questions, but we might take those on notice. I'm going to hand over to Gerard just for the wrap-up.
Thank you very much, Betty. This concludes today's webinar. We just had a question and answer just come in. We might just let Betty deliver that.
Okay.
Hot off the press.
Hot off the press. Okay, so the question. This methodology is unlikely to assist individuals who own passenger motor vehicles where most of the emissions occur. Can you please shed some light on this? For ERF projects, you do need to be creating significant abatement, and for individual vehicle owners, it is unlikely to be worthwhile to have a project. I'll hand back over to Gerard again.
Okay, thank you very much, Perty. This concludes today's webinar. As Perty said earlier, there is a survey that will be presented to you as the webinar closes down. Please take the time to fill this in, as this will provide valuable feedback and allow us to tailor these webinars more to your needs in the future. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future. Thank you.